Hey everyone, welcome to the Zeitgeist on A Mighty Blaze. I am your host, Jane Roper. With me today is Cathy O'Neill, author of The Shame Machine, which has a very cool cover, which I love very much. I don't know if you can see it, but it's got nice, proud, tall, beautiful tulips going into a machine and coming out with their heads bent down. Just really cool. It's great. Cathy O'Neill earned a PhD in math from Harvard and worked as a math professor at Barnard College before switching over to the private sector, working as a quant for the hedge fund D.E. Shaw and as a data scientist in the New York startup scene. She's a regular contributor to Bloomberg Opinion, and in 2016 wrote the best-selling book, Weapons of Math Destruction: How Big Data Increases Inequality and Threatens Democracy, to put it lightly. She is the CEO of Orca, an algorithmic auditing company, is a member of Public Interest Tech Lab at the Harvard Kennedy School. Her new book, The Shame Machine: Who Profits in the New Age of Humiliation, was published in 2022. The New York Times calls the book a clear-eyed warning about the increasingly destructive influence of America's shame industrial complex in the age of social media and hyperpartisan politics. Author Dave Eggers says, O'Neill reminds us that we must resist the urge to judge, belittle, and oversimplify, and instead allow always for complexity and lead always with empathy. Just a quick description of the book. I'm stealing from the inside flap copy, which I'm sure Terry Gross does too, I'm pretty sure. Shame is a powerful and sometimes useful tool. When we publicly shame corrupt politicians, abusive celebrities, or predatory corporations, we reinforce values of fairness and justice. But as Cathy O'Neill argues in this revelatory book, shaming has taken a new and dangerous turn. It is increasingly being weaponized, used as a way to shift responsibility for social problems from institutions to individuals. With clarity and nuance, O'Neill dissects the relationship between shame and power. Whom does the system serve? Is it counterproductive to call out racist, misogynists, and vaccine skeptics? If so, when should someone be canceled? How do current incentive structures perpetuate the shaming cycle? And most important, how can we all fight it back? So welcome, Cathy. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Jane. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, as I mentioned when we were chatting backstage, as someone who's wrote a book that features shame very heavily, I knew in many different aspects, I immediately when I learned about your book that I wanted to check it out. And it really does, like, you cover so many different elements of shame, really more than I expected to, because there are so many angles of the concept. So for starters, I'd love to just know, where did the idea for this come from? What inspired you to write this book?
I guess what happened was when I wrote my book, Weapons of Math Destruction, I did a lot of research for it. And I kept on encountering these terrible algorithms that were doing things like firing people with no explanation. And it was really curious to me why that worked. Like, what was the power behind this opaque, for example, something called the value added model for teachers. It was a scoring system for teachers. They'd get a number between 0 and 100. 0 means you're the worst teacher ever, and 100 means you're the best, theoretically. But actually, nobody could explain these numbers. And a lot of teachers were fired based on low numbers. And, by the way, I had a suspicion, and I have evidence that I'm right, that this was kind of a random number generator. It wasn't really a meaningful number at all. And that made me even more curious, like, why did teachers leave after they're being fired? Why didn't they fight back? And so I would ask these teachers, like, what happened when you were told you were fired based on a low score? Did you ask them to explain your score? And the teachers consistently were saying, oh, well, they told me it was math and I wouldn't understand it. And I was like, what? I was like, wait a second, like, how did that work? So evidently it's math shaming. Right. And evidently, and, by the way, as a mathematician myself, it wouldn't work on me. Right. So that's one of the reasons I was able to observe it, because I was like, wait, I don't understand why you didn't punch them in the face. Right. They're firing you for no good reason. That's not OK, even if it's math,
Right. Right.
But it was really consistent, and it made me realize it was an institutional response. It was it was definitely it was a strategy. If people ask questions, just shame them, and then they'll stop asking questions.
Right.
And so first of all, it's a strategy. And second of all, it works, and so I was really curious about that. I was like, I can talk until I'm blue in the face about the poor statistical properties of this algorithm. But at the end of the day, if it's actually shame, that's the power behind all of this.
Right.
I don't think I know how to talk about it. So that was kind of how my curiosity got kindled.
Yeah.
And I would say like the connect to the dots happened to when a couple of years later, when my book was coming out, actually,
Mm-hmm.
I was researching bariatric surgery because I learned that it was a way to avoid diabetes. My father died of diabetes. My brother had just been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. And I was like, how do I avoid type 2 diabetes? I have all the like risk factors.
Yep.
And I found out that like a bariatric surgery really, really helps.
Yeah.
And I was trying to research it, and I was inundated with fat shaming ads.
Yeah.
And by the way, I worked in ad tech. So like, I even know why I got those ads. Like I know exactly why, you know?
Yeah.
And yet it made me want to crawl into a ball and die. It made me want to buy whatever they were selling. It made me want to cede my rights. And I was like, oh, that's what was happening to the teachers. So when I saw that happening to me, I was like, now I know why it has so much power. And then I started really thinking like, when is shame bullying like this? When does it create profit? When does it exert power? And when, on the flip side of it, is it appropriate? Because obviously shame is sometimes appropriate, you know, like of every civil rights movement is shame-based, like shame on you, South African apartheid. It is evidently like sometimes useful and sometimes not, sometimes appropriate, sometimes not. And so that's really when I became obsessed with thinking about this.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it really is shame is one of the most powerful forces, right? And it's a necessary force in a way, like you're saying, to sort of get people to adhere to certain values and morals of the society. I'd love you to mention the thing you mentioned early in your book, which I think sets the stage really nicely, was the Pueblo Clown Society. Is that what it's called? Yeah. Or can you explain what that is?
Yeah. So I wanted to sort of, I wanted to present a notion of like appropriate shame, healthy shame, I would call it. And so I found out about, through my friend who's an art historian, about the Pueblo Clown Society, where they have these summer rituals. And it's like, there's various kind of solemn ceremonies, but in between the solemn ceremonies is kind of like an entertainment. And those are the clowns. And the clowns like descend, and it happens like every few hours. They show up over the course of a few days. So they descend at the beginning as kind of like aliens, essentially. They're just like covered with chalk, and they have their hair up. And so they look really strange, and they don't know the rules. They don't know how to be Hopi. They do all sorts of embarrassing, terrible things, like they eat poop and they pretend to have sex with each other in public, or maybe they actually have sex. They do some things that are like meant to show that they don't know what the rules are. And then over the course of the different events, they're told the rules. They're like, don't do that, do this, don't do that. And the idea is that they're learning to be Hopi.
Right.
And then by the end, like the third day, the idea is that they are flipping that around. So they are finding people in the community at the ceremony that haven't been Hopi, that have not been sufficiently adherent to the rules, and they're drag them out to publicly shame them. And basically the premise is like, we just learned this rule and it doesn't look like you're following it. Like, why aren't you following it?
Right.
And so it's like this, it is publicly shaming, but what it does really well, unlike what I would call inappropriate shame or punching down shame, what it does really well is first of all, they don't shame people for things that they can't control. They don't shame people for like, for example, they don't shame for people for being an alcoholic. What they do shame people for is bootlegging, selling alcohol in the village.
Right.
And so we think of that as a choice, like you are choosing to do something that's not Hopi, and we want you to choose better. And so that's the first thing that's like really appropriate. And the second thing is that person who they're shaming isn't cast out of the village. They are, in fact, this is entirely a point, that they want them to stay a coherent community, and they want that person as a villager to do better, and to like in the next summer, like this next summer or time that they do this, they don't want to be pulling that same person out. They want, that person will not be shamed if they've improved. So I guess what I'm saying is that person has choice on the one hand, they're doing something wrong and they should get better. And they have voice, which is my other term of art, which is to say they have the chance to defend themselves. They have the chance to be redeemed. They have the chance to be seen doing better. And those are the really important things about shame I understood after thinking about it for 4 years.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And there's so many parallels in there that I was, as you were talking now, so I was reading it, to how that is kind of like the opposite of how so much shame operates in our society. And in particular, I kept for when it comes to online shaming, when people are shamed for something they did, it could be on a huge spectrum of something quite innocent to something pretty awful. But there's always this sense of like, no, there's no chance for redemption. You're out. That's it.
Right.
And some people now will start talking about the idea of calling people in as opposed to calling them out, right? You might shame them, but it's like you said, it's in the interest of getting them to reform and change. Another notion you bring up is this idea of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
So in a society like with the Hopi, the rules are all pretty well known, but in times of rapid change and rapid and dissent and division, sometimes people can be like, well, wait, I don't know what the rules are anymore. Like you brought up the great example of masks, for example, during the pandemic, which was one of those. But can you talk a little about that whole notion of not knowing the rules or cognitive dissonance?
Right. Well, of course, there's lots of different kinds of cognitive dissonance. I guess the first one is that there is true, like I literally didn't know. Like, and one of the examples I bring up is like about pronouns. One of the aspects of social media is that we feel like we are making progress on these norms. Ultimately, by the way, I should say that like ultimately shaming is about norms, right? You shame somebody for not adhering to a norm. Right. And so going back to social media, we're in a large group, large being relative though, like we're in a group of maybe 100,000 people, and we all think that we've agreed on a new rule, right? A new norm. Right. But actually there's 300 million people in this country. So a lot of people miss the memo. Right. And I think for me, the example, and we were talking about this before we started, like I have kids, so I know a lot about this, the pronoun stuff, but I know a lot of people who don't have children who are a little bit older than me. They get completely confused by the idea of pronouns. And it's not because they're not progressive. There's lots of progressive people who, if they were in that conversation in the first place, they would have followed it. But they missed it. They actually missed the conversation. And so on the one hand, that is the nature of changing norms, is that people will always feel like, wait, what just happened? It's like the earth is shifting under my feet. Right. But I would say that it's happening even more in the age of social media, because within social media, we really do feel like we're making progress really quickly. Right. And sometimes that feeling is mistaken. So that's one kind of like, that's a confusion related to shaming. So that's a confused reaction to shame. And it can also backfire. Like if people are consistently shamed as if they were intending to be wrong, intending to sort of be anti-woke or whatever that would look like. Then it could backfire, because they can be like, well, I don't care about this pronoun thing, and I'm not going to learn about it, because they can feel attacked. So that's a kind of a backfiring of shame. Yeah. There's another notion of cognitive dissonance, though, if you don't mind me also mentioning it. Oh, please. Yeah. So, I mean, and I think people will recognize this. Let's just go straight to the example of like white fragility. Like there's this like, I'm a good person, so I can't be racist. So this kind of defensive cognitive dissonance. Right. And it can happen to an individual, of course, and it does a lot. I think a lot of the Me Too victims, I'll put that in air quotes, often felt like, wait, I was following the rules, and I'm a good guy, and like, why?
In that day, it was okay to make those comments, and in that day, it was okay to do that.
It was fine, So there's a lot of that, like, not me. I'm not the one who should be accused, and it's sort of a grievance, essentially. Yeah. So it can happen to individuals, but it can also happen to groups, and it's part of a larger sort of what I think of as phases of shame. So like the first phase is like you get shamed and you feel bad. It feels terrible. Actually, I should define shame. Shame is sort of when you feel unlovable, like you feel unworthy of love. So if you feel that bad, you're going to want to get to the second phase as quickly as possible. And what that looks like is either you're in denial or you're in cognitive dissonance, where you're just like, not me, because I am lovable. I have to be. Right. Because that's my entire sense of self is based on that assumption. And to be honest, a lot of people just never get past that. Like they, they can get triggered back into this. So when I was a child and I was fat shamed a lot, I would feel terrible, but then I would just get into this denial phase where I would just be like, well, if I never look in the mirror and I never think about my body and I never look down, I will, I don't have to think about it, but then of course I'd get re-triggered back into the phase one of sitting in my shame.
Right.
And then there's this notion of like getting past those phases. Like it's possible to do that. I call it reckoning.
Yep.
So if you have a personal reckoning, that would get into phase 3. So if my personal reckoning for fat shaming was, I've tried diets. Every time I try a diet, I temporarily lose weight, but then I end up heavier. It's not good for my, insulin reaction. Like this is not working for me. Right. Yeah. So for me, this isn't working. That's a reckoning personally. And then there's like the fourth final phase, which often people don't get to, is like a kind of, social justice level of reckoning where you're just like, wait a second, like diets don't work. Like the diet industry is selling us a lie and shaming us to make us buy their product that doesn't work. Like, what the heck?
Yeah.
And I will say that I'm making it sound like you're always going to progress through these phases, but it's certainly not true. Like my first example of like how I decided to write this book was me going from phase 4, where I was like, the diet industry is terrible, to being like, boom, back in phase 1.
Right.
So it's not as if this is like a linear journey.
Yeah.
And you always end up transcending shame. That is not the point at all.
Right. Well, I thought the irony, just touching on that last point about like the bariatric surgery, about how you were saying that, so there, there's fat shaming on the one hand, and then there's also people who get the surgery, trying to keep it a secret because they don't want people to think they cheated. So it's like even your method for losing weight has to be somehow pure and built on sweat equity and working hard, which just perpetuates the shame. It's like, it's your fault. It's your fault. You should be able to do it the right way.
That's very right. And it's because we attach morality to these things. It's not just for fatness, although it really is. There really are people who just pretend they honestly lost weight, right?
Right.
But it's also for like alcoholism or other kinds of forms of addiction. Like we attach morality to it so much that it's really hard for us to think about it as a physical problem that we have. Right. And of course, one of the reasons I mention all this is because my basic premise is that shame doesn't actually help. Like when you're shaming somebody based on something like a physical problem that they're having, like fatness or addiction,
right?
They already have a problem, and now you're making them have another problem, which is the shame that they have to grapple with. It doesn't actually help them solve the problem because it's not a choice in the first place.
Yeah.
And so that makes it an inappropriate thing to attempt to shame somebody for that.
It's punching down. So, and you talk also about, just moving on from that a little bit, people profit off of that shame, right? Yeah. You talk about the diet industry, talk about some other, you want to just tell us a little bit more about the ways that people make money off of shame.
Yes. Well, I mean, let's start with the pharmaceutical companies, like the Sackler families, making so much money off of their addictive opioids, and then literally emailing each other, blame the addicts. Like they are the problem. It wasn't us. It didn't quite fly, thank goodness, but they did make a huge amount of profit, and they're very rich to this day.
Right.
And they've hidden a lot of that money offshore. And then you think downstream from that of the rehab clinics that often just fleece people who care about their loved ones who are addicted, but actually do not offer the most basic kind of medical assisted treatment that is known to work better than anything else.
Right.
Because again, it's supposed to be a moral thing. So they're supposed to give up all drugs, and it's immoral. It's seen as immoral or impure if they don't. So
weakness. Yeah,
it's a weakness. It's a moral weakness. So that's another version of profiting. And then there's sort of like old school profits. There's that drug. I'm spacing on the name because I'm terrible with this, but that's supposed to like make, if you're older, to make your memory better.
Oh yeah, that's right. The jellyfish one.
The jellyfish one. Thank you. And that's sort of like just shaming people for being older, and just sort of like buying into the senility shame that they might be experiencing.
Right.
And then there's the one of my favorite examples is like Vagisil's OMG exclamation point for OMV exclamation point for like oh my vagina, I suppose.
Yeah.
The idea there is to shame young girls. So it's targeted to teenagers for what they call period funk. So sort of giving a name to a smell that they immediately frame as shameful.
Right.
And then like buy this product so that your period funk will be gone. And of course, gynecologists are like, don't put anything down there. You're going to get a yeast infection. And then, by the way, if you get a yeast infection, you'll have to buy the Vagisil yeast infection medicine. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Right.
So it's profit over profit.
Yeah.
So, and that's nothing new in a certain sense. Like basically, like makeup companies, cosmetics is about shaming older women for being older.
Right.
You know, it's many, many hundreds of years old.
Right.
What I think, and I still think it's happening much more now, and partly that's because of the social media way of targeting these ads to specifically to people with known vulnerabilities. That's what we do when we target ads.
Right.
But I do want to point out that, like, why I call it the new age of humiliation is I do think there's a new kind of profiting from shame, and that is embodied by the social media platforms. So
Yes.
all the examples I just gave you, you shame the person, make them buy a product from you, right? Mm-hmm. You're fat, buy a diet. You're old, buy this drug. Yeah. Whereas with social media, what they've done, which is ingenious, although horrible, is they've created a place for us to live and to exist, and where they condition us to shame each other.
Yes. Right.
And they profit off of our activities. So they don't have to directly shame us because they're just like, we're not going to shame you directly. We're just going to let you guys hate each other. And we're going to put the perfect setup for that.
And nothing, right, like nothing goes more viral than an online shaming. And everyone piles on. They do it partly, I think, because there's like a sort of, oh yeah, let's get them kind of mentality. But then they do it also, as you write about, as a means of virtue signaling. Like, I too disapprove of this, and I'm going to show you how, I'm doing anti-racism by, shame by liking this video. It's like, well, right. No, you're not.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. This is a little harder than that.
Yeah.
But it's not only, and you said it and you're right, that like outrageous shaming, content goes viral. But I just want to point out, like, as an expert in algorithms, that's not a coincidence. Like that is what is optimized. That is what's privileged by the Facebook newsfeed algorithm. That is how the algorithms actually work. They are trying to privilege viral outrage tweets, because the thing that gets people to stay on social media the longest is the stuff where they get into fights.
Right.
Just think about the last time you stayed on social media for hours. It wasn't because you were like, oh, cute puppies, everyone's getting along.
Right.
It's because you got you got upset.
Right. And then you keep going back to check, like, did someone reply to me? Did someone support me? Did someone put me down? Do I have to? Yeah. And it becomes, it's a trap that they got you.
And they don't have to actually do anything to us directly. They just serve us this. Right. They condition us indirectly to be shame driven.
Right. Yep. So you had Chris saying, if any diet or product actually worked, everyone would buy it. Right. Yeah. The high school teacher told our class that in 1977. There's a lot of money to be made in fat shaming, for sure. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And and certainly in like age shaming as well. I mean, it's weird. As I was reading your book, I was thinking about the fact that, like, all right, as I'm getting up there, toward 50, it's like I start, I look at what's happening to my skin or my body, and I feel that I feel shame, as if I should, like, it's not my fault. It's not my fault. Like, if I'm, it's such a weird thing. Like, why should I be embarrassed for my body going under a natural aging process? And I guess it does come back to, it's like, well, you could fix it, right? There are ways to fix it. Why aren't you going to try to fix it?
That's a really good point, Jane. And that is one of my basic points of most of the shaming tactics. I talked earlier about the notion of choice. Mm-hmm. Like, nobody chooses to be fat. Like,
right.
I mean, maybe a couple people in the world, but very, very few people do. Most people are desperate to get thin, right? Similarly, nobody chooses to get wrinkles or to sag, or to become addicted to a drug. But the premise that these sort of for-profit shaming machines have is that they frame it as a choice.
Right.
You know, like, why this is a choice, why aren't you making the right one?
Right.
You could be a 10, why are you settling for a 7? Or you could be a 7, why are you settling for a 4?
Right.
And I'm saying numbers because one of the things that fascinates me is just how much metrics matter to people. Like, as soon as like there's something to count,
yes,
or there's 2 numbers to compare,
right,
people are just like, I'm in it. I'm like, this is a competition, and I know what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to improve my score. And like, it's like we've gamified, you know, our entire culture. And it's not, I don't blame us, by the way. I'm just saying it is like the nature of our culture. It's the nature of like trying to get into college, you know, that we have to like compete not only with every other high school kid in the world, but with, you know, the US News and World Report ranking system. And like, we have to know where we stand relative to all other people. There is something, of course, deeply human about a basic level of competition, but the point we've gotten where it's just so, there's so many ways that we're measured and ranked. It's enough to make anyone super anxious.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And the way we, even, you know, the number of followers you have or the number of likes you have, or, you know, that's like an ongoing competition in a way.
Yes.
I see one of my kiddos who's, you know, on TikTok and like so into like how many likes they get or how many comments they get, and then it becomes like a source of shame. It's like, oh, well, how come no one likes my video? You know, how come I'm not getting more likes? And it becomes you get trapped early on. I wanted to also ask about something I thought was really interesting was the notion you write about the incel sort of subculture and what that's all about, and it's really almost a indulgence in shame in a way that ends up turning into something much darker. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so incels are almost entirely men, and the idea there is that they're involuntarily celibate. That's what incel stands for. And they were like initially sort of meeting on relatively well-known sites, but those sites mostly got shut down, but they still meet in various places. And I guess one of the reasons I brought them up as an example is, first of all, they can only exist in the era of the internet. Like, it is essentially a modern problem. Like, you'd have individuals who are very unhappy in the past, of course, but to develop this culture. And the culture is essentially self-protective against people who are trying to shame them for all the misogynistic. They're super misogynistic, often very racist, but the most important part is like they sort of legitimize their anger and their grievances against women by saying like that women are like always just trying to have sex with the highest ranked male. They think of it as they have a sort of pseudoscientific structure and ideology. And so it's really strange and weird, but the most important part of it, from my perspective, is that actually shaming them will not help. Like, shaming them, first of all, because they've built up a lot of defenses in their culture against people trying to shame them into behaving differently. But also because one of the things that, and this is going to sound really obvious, but it's important to remember, one of the things that you have to keep in mind when you're shaming someone, even if it's appropriate because they have voice and choice, which incels do. Like, if you're talking about your son, he has voice because he can talk to you. He has a choice to be an incel or not because he has. But it's still not necessarily going to work to shame them unless they actually agree with the underlying norm. And so, going back to the question about the mask wearing. Mask wearing is a great example of something that is a choice. And if you're talking to someone one-on-one, they have the voice to defend themselves, and they have the opportunity to be seen putting on their mask and behaving better. But if they don't agree with the masks, if they don't agree with the underlying norm, not only is it not going to work to shame them, but it's actually going to backfire. Just like for incels, you're going to be seen as the enemy, and it's just going to escalate. And what happens when that, and that's very, very common in our lives. I'm not saying anything that's a new idea. But the point is that shame, when you misfire, which I would call this a misfire, if you don't check first that there's an underlying norm that's agreed on, but even if they have choice and voice, it will backfire and escalate, and
Right.
they will be backed into their corner, and the norms will separate even more.
Right.
So what you'll see is over time, you'll see norm groups actually getting further and further apart.
Right.
Rather than sort of cohering. And see, remember going back to the Hopi clown example, the
Yeah.
idea with that shame was that it was coherent. The idea was, let's stick together, let's be Hopi. Whereas what I'm talking about here is like you're sort of lobbing grenades at the next group over. And the truth is, like, shaming, even attempting to shame someone, is seen as a violent act for a reason. It's like it is really, really intense to shame somebody.
Right.
So if somebody perceives you as shaming you, if I perceive you as shaming me for something I don't even agree with, I'm outraged. I'm like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
You're punching me in the stomach for no good reason. Exactly.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
So anyway, the point is I'm trying to say is that sometimes shame is exactly the wrong tactic.
Right.
Like, in fact, it's not good to shame people.
Right.
And if your son is an incel, which, I mean, I'm sure a lot of sons are, like, the best thing for that is to show your son that he has other options than to stay on a hate site all day. Like, you know what I mean? Like, just make sure that he has friends and that he has places to go. Like, it's not, you don't shame him for doing that because it won't work.
Right. Yep. It's almost never right, especially when it's someone who is genuinely suffering. So let's talk about, in the time we have left, I would love to, hold on a second, comment from Alistair Mook. Great conversation. It strikes me that the paucity of this kind of honest and thoughtful examination of shame is central to its power in society.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I do feel, if I may say, that if I can help the conversation around shame a little bit, I might be wrong about some of these things. Even I'm willing to be wrong.
Yeah.
But what I do think is that we could do a lot better.
Yeah.
If we thought about it more, if we sort of had a way of deciding, wait, is this punching up or punching down? Like, what just happened to me? Or what did I just see there on the street? Like, was that appropriate?
Right.
Whereas what we do, because shame is so immediate and it's so horrible as a feeling, it's pre-rational, essentially. It happens so fast that we almost never actually analyze it. So that really is the contribution I'm hoping to make, is to, like, give people a lens to actually recognize it and to be able to analyze it a little bit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it is so subtle, right? Because you talk about, there's a difference between punching up and punching down. So I do want to talk a little bit more about, like, punching up and the ways shame can be really powerful and appropriate. But there also are there's situations where you're sort of in the middle, right? Where if you have, like, your everyday sort of, the Karen, right, who does pull some racist maneuver, and that sucks, and she is in a position of power, right, and has a choice not to behave the way she does, but then the shame sort of goes haywire and out of control, and next thing you know, she's got people camped outside her house, and loses her job and all this stuff, and it's like, oh, well, okay, is that punching up or is that punching down, or is it some kind of weird hybrid of the two?
You're right to ask that, and it can theoretically be both, right? It can be very gray. I mean, look, let me put it this way. There's reasons that we have a legal system that guarantees due process, and the right to appeal, and the right to meet your accuser. Like, there, you know what I mean? Like, there's all sorts of things that we can think about as principles that will lend themselves to a situation where you're just like, well, Karen, she really did something wrong, but on the other hand, I'm never going to see her again, and I won't keep track of her. And I will only know her. She will only be known to the vast majority of these people as the person that did that.
The villain,
So the villain. And if that's the case, then that's really not due process. There's no right to appeal. There's no ability for her to redeem herself. I will personally not pile onto that.
Yeah.
But to your point, if that person's also in power, and I will keep track of them, and I will see them get better. Right. Like, if you're talking about a Louis C.K. situation where you're just like, you were an idol to my children. Like, I need you to do better, Yeah. That's different. And I do think punching up, because there is a voice, there is choice. I mean, and particularly the voice, like, they are celebrities. Right. So they have the voice. then it becomes a more clear-cut case.
Right, exactly. And so that some of the examples that, I mean, you talk a lot about Me Too, also the movement against police corruption in Nigeria. And these are great examples of where, and I think, you know, Me Too is probably the most familiar. Well, I think there was reckoning for, you know, for women sort of taking, I don't know, maybe stepping forward and accusing people who weren't in power, not accusing, but let's just say finding their voice or finding their power with regard to not necessarily famous people. Like it had impact well beyond famous people, which is great. But it was a way that shame was used in really powerful and, I would say, just ways to bring people, or attempt to bring people, you know, back in line who had gotten out of line.
I agree. And, you know, I would add that like civil rights movements like Me Too, and I would consider that to be one, are messy. And they do sort of grab people who don't necessarily deserve that up in so it's not always a perfect outcome.
Right.
And actually that's kind of my point, is that shame is a crude tool. It is a crude tool, even when it's appropriate, even when it's punching up. And to be clear, punching up is when you're holding power to account.
Right.
You know, but it is sometimes the only tool you have.
Right.
It is the only tool. Like I go back to South Africa apartheid. Like the actual lawmakers were doing something immoral. What are you going to do? Like you don't have control over the law. You can't appeal to the judge.
Right.
You have to use international shame tactics, and it worked.
Yeah. Yep. And in the civil rights movement here in the U.S., when, you know, calling, you know, letting the world witness, look how they're behaving toward us, you know, peaceful protesters. And not that that's the only way, but it is. It's incredibly powerful.
It is.
But that's a great point, that it's not a perfect tool. It's not my precision.
When it's appropriate and it's working. It's crude.
Yeah. That's a great point. So I guess the only final thing, well, you kind of already spoke to it, what you would love people to take away from this, I guess, is thinking about these things maybe with a greater level of subtlety, or I don't know, what else would you say to folks sort of in our age of shame that you would love them to think more about?
Well, I think a lot, you know, obviously I think a lot about individual choices, but I really want to emphasize that places like social media, institutions like welfare offices, or even police departments, they are institutionally shaming. And so we should think about, how do we remove inherently shaming policies and rules from institutions? So if anybody's out there listening who's building an institution, designing so whether it's a social media platform or an actual, you know, department in a company, like it behooves us to think through, like, what is inherently shaming. And to that point, I draw on the work of Donna Hicks, who wrote this book called Dignity. Dignity is kind of the opposite of shame. So we just had lunch the other day, and we were just amazed by how similar our topics actually are. But she has this list of dignity violations, which are basically shaming. Signs that something is shaming. One of them is like not giving due process. One of them is not trusting, or not having fairness. And I just would love people to think through, like, if they have the opportunity to look at those dignity violations, like, how do you design an institution, or even just a family, if you will, to avoid dignity violations, to promote healthy shame, or no shame.
Right. Certainly.
A bullying shame.
Right.
So it's the individual that I want to get to, but I really also want to get to sort of thinking systemically too.
Right. Because if it's baked in, I mean, we didn't even get to talk as much about the whole notion of like poverty, poverty shaming. We touched on some about addiction, but right. If the prison system, right? I think so many people would balk against the idea that there should be greater dignity for people who are incarcerated, and yet if they were given more dignity, think how much more transformative that time incarcerated could probably be in terms of their life going forward and preventing recidivism and all that.
And it doesn't have to be just a fantasy we think about. Like in most other, like in Northern European countries, like prison is much more dignified, and the outcomes are much better. So it's not just a pipe dream.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. This has been just fascinating. Like I said, the book is really wonderful and provoking. And I just like, it's just so meaty. Like I hope people will pick it up.
Thank you.
It touches on so much that is sort of in the air and in the zeitgeist of our, cultural conversations today. So thank you for sharing your time with us, sharing your book with the world. And yes, I think we put up a link of where folks can buy it. And yeah, I hope everyone will get their hands on it. Yes, we have the link up there to our bookshop store. So thank you so much, Cathy. I really appreciate it.